Hi A&P1 students. Not very many people joined the online lecture today. And besides that, we fumbled around a little bit, going back and forth in Blackboard and Zoom. 1 o'clock doesn't seem to be a great time to use the internet for a webcast. But we're going to try I'll just redo the lecture and post it on YouTube for you. So this lecture is again about the cord, but more specifically the nerves that emerge in a cord and how they form these networks called plexus. And also we'll look at the function of spinal nerves, how in reflexes. So a sensory component and a motor response without input from the that I'm going to present to you is found in 13 mainly. There's a little spinal cord in 12, and then the spinal nerves are treated as peripheral nervous system in chapter 13. And any details that you need to know are listed in study questions 17 and 18. Where to put my picture, it's weird. Okay, so let's just first review the spinal nerves. There are 31 pairs. That means we have a pair including one on the right and one on the left, so bilateral spinal nerves. They innervate all parts of the body except the face. The neck has innervation of both cranial nerves and spinal nerves. But all of them mixed, meaning they're going to have sensory as components of sensory neurons, components of motor neurons. So you could get signals traveling in both directions in a spinal nerve. So the 31 pairs are subdivided categories based on where they emerge from the cerebral column. So the 8 are cervical nerves. I'm not sure why. The 8 pairs of cervical nerves emerge in the intervertebral foramen, or between the vertebrae of the cervical vertebrae. The 12 thoracic nerves leave the spinal cord from... Something's happening. Hold on a second. I have no idea. It's the cloud. Can't tell you. There are 12 pairs of thoracic nerves, and they emerge from in between thoracic vertebrae. 5 pairs of lumbar nerves that emerge between lumbar vertebrae. 5 sacral nerves that come out of the holes in the sacrum, and then 1 pair of coccygeal nerves. Remember, they all have both motor and sensory parts to them and functions. Also, before I start talking about the functioning of the nerve and a little bit more anatomy, I need to review these spinal nerves are connected to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is shown in this diagram, in this slide, and notice that there are some little tiny fibers that we refer to as rootlets. So there are some dorsal rootlets and there are some ventral rootlets. They merge to form the ventral root, respectively. Notice that the dorsal root has a bump in it called the dorsal root ganglion. And that's where you'll find cell bodies of sensory neurons. The cell bodies of motor neurons are within the spinal cord's gray matter, which I'm trying to draw on here for you. So these two roots, the dorsal root and the ventral root, merge before they come out of the vertebral canal, and they merge to form the spinal nerve. And they'll be ensheathed in the same connective tissue eventually as well. a spinal nerve leaves the vertebral canal and it travels out into the body, the first thing that it does is it splits again. So it just merged to form and now it's going to split. And where the names of these branches are rami. So the one that goes dorsally is the dorsal ramus, and the one that goes ventrally is the ventral ramus. What I have circled in this picture is the spinal nerve. Notice how short that spinal nerve really is. It's really, really short. So that's the arrow. And it's circling it. Now that's not to say that the rami aren't part of the spinal nerve. They are. But I guess when it's all intact in one piece, it's quite short. I have a better the branching, the merging and the branching to form spinal nerves. So we have the dorsal root here, the ventral root here, and they merge to form the spinal nerve. Then right away a branch goes dorsally and a branch goes kind of more laterally, but eventually it's going to come around to the front, so we call it the ventral or anterior ramus. Now the reason we bring up the idea of rami at all, because of the structures that these two branches innervate. The anterior ramus, as you can imagine, must go to the front of the body, and it does, and I'll try to trace it here in this tiny little picture. I'm going to do yellow. Well, the yellow's not going to work. I'm going to do red again. A little thicker. Okay, so here's the anterior ramus. And it comes around. So it not only innervates the side of the wall of the body, but it also innervates the front. The dorsal ramus goes posteriorly, and it innervates just the back muscles and skin. So the deep muscles and the skin of the back would be innervated by the posterior ramus, and the anterior ramus, again, it's skin and muscles, but it's lateral as well as anterior. Now both rami have sensory and motor components, just like the spinal nerve did to begin with. So there's somatic sensory, somatic motor to skeletal muscles, and there's even some visceral motor, but we're not going to worry about that. Because of course your skin has some smooth muscle in blood vessels and glands. So usually when we name nerves, we're not dealing with, right next to the spinal cord. We usually name nerves based on where they're located peripherally and what structures they innervate. So these nerves that branch off of the anterior ramus here are called cutaneous nerves because they're going to the skin. So there's an anterior cutaneous nerve and a lateral cutaneous nerve, and then of course the dorsal ramus has a posterior cutaneous nerve. Another interesting thing about how these rami weave and anatomically are in the body is that the anterior rami form nerve plexuses. These plexuses are interlacing networks. And so what you'll have is crossover of neurons from one spinal nerve to another, superior to inferior. So there's four cervical plexus, or four nerve plexuses, and I'm going to show them to you so you know what I mean, because it's hard to describe. The cervical plexus is made up of the first five cervical spinal nerves. The brachial plexus is made up of C4, C5, C6, C7, C8, and the first thoracic spinal nerve. The lumbar plexus is made up of L1 through L4 spinal nerves, and the sacral plexus largely by sacral nerves, but also the last two lumbar nerves. Notice that there is no nerve plexus formed distinctly in the thoracic region. So thoracic spinal nerve 2 to thoracic spinal nerve 12, there's no nerve plexus. They travel very parallel to one another and they don't interweave like I'm going to show you. So here's the cervical plexus. And what you can see coming out of the vertebral canal, C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, I don't know if that's C5. Anyway, so notice that this purple region is where they just emerged from the intervertebral foramen, from the vertebral canal. But then they start branching. And now this is just the anterior ramus. This is not part of the dorsal ramus. So all of these are just anterior rami containing both motor, that looks funny, and sensory. But a neuron will leave from C1 and it might end up all the way down here. A neuron might start, well, it usually doesn't go up, but it could. It could go this way. So this has benefits and, of course, disadvantages. A disadvantage is it makes it a lot more difficult to diagnose where there might be a cervical spinal cord problem, depending on the symptoms you see in someone. But on the other hand, it also helps retain function if there is a spinal cord injury at a certain location. I don't mean a complete transection of the spinal cord, but I mean like a little lesion. Another part of this plexus could take over innervation of a muscle and you'd still have function of that muscle. So a nerve that you should be aware of in particular that comes off of this cervical plexus is the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve comes from C1 through C5 right here, and it innervates the diaphragm. So that's one of the reasons spinal cord injuries can affect breathing, is depending on where the injury is. If the phrenic nerve is not getting input and it's not going to the diaphragm, it's hard for somebody to breathe on their own. Now, a little bit farther down, coming out of the vertebral column, is the brachial plexus, the vertebral canal, the brachial plexus, and that's C4 through T1. And again, you have this interlacing. So a neuron could start at C6 and make its way here. You know, it kind all over. It's probably different in different people, how many neurons cross at which level, but overall there's a general scheme to it. And again, we usually name these nerves out in the periphery according to the structures that they innervate. So, for example, the radial nerve is more peripheral, or at least more lateral from the spinal cord. And the radial nerve innervates the muscles of the arm and the forearm on the back side, whereas the ulnar nerve innervates structures on the front of the arm and the hand. We already did this one. Okay. Okay, let's look at the lumbar plexus now. Picture again. The lumbar plexus, L1 to L5. And so here's where the spinal nerves leave the vertebral canal. And they again form, the anterior rami again are forming quite an extensive plexus. And these will eventually innervate the muscles in the anterior part of the leg. and we aren't going to learn a specific nerve for this one. But in the sacral plexus, I want to show you a nerve that I'm sure you've heard of. So now we have the sacral spinal nerves emerging from the vertebral canal, and the nerves are L4 to S4, and they actually move posteriorly and travel through this hole called the obturator foramen. You don't have to remember that, but that's what it's called, the obturator foramen, a skeletal structure. And the plexus is just like before. It's the anterior rami, but the anterior rami move backwards. They move posteriorly so that the nerves can innervate the back of the leg. And one that's very large and runs all the way from the sacrum down to your toes is the sciatic nerve. And I bet you've heard of that. So the sciatic nerve is really two different nerves that kind of travel together. The common fibular as well as the tibial, at least at this point, and then they branch. But you just have to know sciatic. Okay, what is the significance of learning about these nerve plexuses? One significance has to do with the function of motor function. So most muscles in the upper and lower limbs are innervated by more than one spinal nerve. So damage to one spinal cord segment won't paralyze any particular muscle. For example, the musculocutaneous nerve, which innervates the biceps brachii, your forearm muscle that helps you do, not your forearm muscle, your arm muscle that helps you do curls with weights, is derived from this cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, C5 through C7. And the phrenic nerve, for example, goes to the diaphragm, and it's from the cervical plexus. So this right here should say brachial plexus. There's also significance to these nerve plexuses in terms of sensory function. So our joints, as well as our skin, have receptors, and the receptors pick up stimulation, and then a sensory signal is sent to the spinal cord. Many nerves can innervate the skin at a specific region, as well as many nerves can innervate joints in a specific location. So multiple nerves are going to carry sensory information. Now, we know basically the regions of skin innervated by each nerve, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But because of this plexus, it's important that when you're trying to anesthetize, numb a region of the skin, that you anesthetize more than one spinal nerve because of the plexuses. But the sensory function is nice to have it spread out in case there's any damage to a particular nerve. So here's what's known as the Dermatome Map. It's a map of the skin, the surface area of the skin, and what spinal nerve carries sensory information from it. So a dermatome is a specific region of the skin. So they're labeled here, and there's lines that denote, like that's one. I can't draw very well. This isn't very precise. Here's another. Okay, so this region. So those are dermatomes. And This map represents, to the best of our knowledge, which spinal nerve carries sensory information from the skin to the spinal cord. Now remember, because of the plexuses, these dermatomes really overlap, or could, varies by person, by as much as 50%. So we need to make sure we anesthetize 3 successive spinal nerves to get a total loss of sensation. So let's say that you are going to have surgery, shoulder surgery right here in the T1 region. Before they make that incision, they would want to anesthetize C5, probably more than that, but C5, T1, and T2. Now this map is only for the front of the body. We have a map for the back, the side, and everything. So this is just another dermatome map to show you that we do have more information than just the front of the body. So that's most of the anatomy and function of spinal nerves that I wanted to tell you about. The rest of this lecture that we talked about earlier today deals with something called reflexes. And I thought we needed a little light humor, so I found some cartoons. So if we're talking about reflexes, we're talking about something that can't be controlled. And there are what we call autonomic reflexes. And autonomic reflexes involve smooth muscle or glands action component. But today, since we're talking about somatic reflexes, and the motor function in somatic spinal reflexes will involve voluntary muscle, so skeletal muscle. Normally you control consciously skeletal muscles, but there are times when the skeletal muscles contract reflexively, sort of stimulation that we'll get today. Okay, so to the cartoons. Doctor is testing a patient's reflexes, and after he hit the knee probably with the hammer, obviously the patient's reflexes must be good because he hit the roof. I think this one's even better because this time the involuntary action, which should happen, straightening of the leg once you tap the patellar tendon right there. This time the patient hit the doctor in the chin. Let's hope that never happens to you. And then this one over here is just kind of a joke because there's a ninja here. And so obviously ninja fighters are known for having great reflexes. I don't know. It's important that you realize that when we talk about this reflexive action, sensory to motor, the brain is not going to be needed. So for example, you may not believe this, but it's sort of true. When you touch something hot accidentally, you pull your hand away before your brain ever registers that you've touched something hot. So the brain is not required for these particular reflexes. In order to talk about the reflexes are transmitted into the cord and then out of the cord, I think I should review with you from the last lecture the structure of neurons that are going into the cord and the structure of neurons that are leaving the cord. So, first and foremost, this is posterior, this side of the cord, and this is anterior. And sensory information comes in posteriorly, whereas motor information going out to the muscles leaves ventrally. So that's first. Then comes the parts of the neurons, okay? So if we have sensory information coming in, a spinal nerve, so it's going to come in this way, what is carrying that information are dendrites of a sensory neuron. So the blue line and the green line right there are dendrites of a sensory neuron. And the cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglion. And we call them dendrites because they're carrying an electrical signal towards the cell body. When an electrical signal leaves or is traveling away from the cell body, then we call that nerve fiber an axon. So the axons enter the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. They usually synapse on really short interneurons that I circled right there. And then the interneurons synapse on the motor neurons, which have their cell bodies ventrally. So these fibers coming out of the spinal cord, all of these, the yellow one and the red one, those are axons of motor neurons. So in summary, a spinal nerve, it consists of, out here, here's the spinal nerve, out here. It consists of dendrites of sensory neurons and axons of motor neurons. Now we're going to look at a reflex. Okay, so the spinal cord is a somatic reflex, and did any of that record? Damn. Well, how am I going to know? Unless I keep going. Okay, so the spinal cord is a somatic reflex center, and I'm going to show you what's known as a reflex arc. Here is the skin where stimuli are detected, right here. So say it's a pinprick. A sensory neuron is connected to some sort of a receptor. The dendrite travels to the dorsal root ganglion. The electrical signal continues out the axon into the spinal cord. Here's an interneuron, and then the motor neuron goes out to the muscle. And this muscle we call an effector. So the characteristics of spinal reflexes, you have to have stimulation. Stimulation is required. That skeletal muscle isn't going to contract on its own unless there's some disorder, without some sort of stimulation. So it's not spontaneous, but it is involuntary. It occurs without the intent, or, I guess, calculated purpose of contraction. It's difficult to suppress because this stimulation is not planned. So if you were to think about holding your finger over a hot flame, you'd be able to control the reflex. Thinking of, it caught your body by surprise, you would have a quick reflexive action. It occurs the same time, or the same way. So there are different components, typically already gone over. There's a sensory receptor of some sort. A sensory receptor. There's a sensory neuron. Then the spinal cord is the integration center, and that mainly consists of just synapses with the interneuron. Then there's a motor neuron and an effector. And the effector is a skeletal muscle. And those things are written on this slide. I want to show you two specific examples of somatic reflexes. One is known as the withdrawal reflex, just a plain simple withdrawal reflex. The other one's a little bit more complicated. It is still a withdrawal reflex, but it's going to involve both sides of the body, not just the side of the body that received stimulation. So let's start with the easy one first. the withdrawal reflex. In this situation, our stimulus is pain, and what we want to do is to withdraw our hand. There are many movements that can cause this, moving your hand away or your arm away. But one thing that does happen is the biceps brachii, which is shown here, contracts. And that bends your elbow and pulls your hand away. So that's what we need to have happen. So there'll be a sensory neuron that goes into the spinal cord, an interneuron, and a motor neuron that comes out to that biceps brachii, causing it to contract. But one thing that we should think about with this withdrawal reflex is that movements are never quite as simple as just acting or stimulating one particular muscle. In fact, what we also need to do is relax the triceps brachii. It needs to relax because it is an antagonistic muscle to the biceps brachii. And so the triceps brachii will be told to relax at the same time that the biceps brachii is told to contract. And when we say told to, we mean excited for contraction and inhibited for relaxation. Proper circuitry that we'd want to look at for the withdrawal reflex. So let's say our stimulus is that we've touched something hot. The sensory information goes in, and here's this nice beautiful white neuron. Now that white interneuron is going to connect to motor neurons, but at the same time it's going to send a signal through an axonal branch upwards, ascending to the brain. But that's going to take some time, so you will actually complete this reflex arc before it gets to your brain. Okay, so this white interneuron synapses on two motor neurons. In one case, it's going to excite a motor neuron, and in the other case, it will inhibit it. And the way that can happen is it depends on what receptors the motor neuron has, whether or not it's going to be excited or inhibited. So, of course, what we want to be excited is the biceps brachii right here. Sometimes we use a plus sign or the letter E for excited. And the triceps we want to be inhibited, and that's what will happen. Notice that if this is your right hand, that's the side that the sensory information is going in on. The motor information is also coming out on the right side. So that's a unilateral reflex. Now we're going to look at one that's a little bit more complicated, which involves both sides of the body. I've already drawn all over it. It's terrible. Oh, good. Look at that. Okay. Now, in this instance, we are going to have a sensory component that's just on one side. And since it's shown here, we'll say that's the right side, of course, but that's where the sensory neuron is. The motor component is going to be bilateral on both sides. Notice you have some orange motor neurons coming out on the right side, and you have some blue, I'm going to sneeze just a minute. Sorry, some blue motor neurons coming out on the left side right there. So the purpose of having a reflex affect both sides of the body is particularly important when we're talking about the lower limb so that we can maintain balance. We always need to keep one leg steady on the ground, on the earth, no matter what happens with the other leg. So on the same side that we receive sensory, on the right side, there will be a withdrawal of the foot. On the left side, we don't want the left foot to withdraw because you'd fall down. So the left foot and the left leg actually is going to contract to form or to make things stable. So to talk about the effectors, we need to understand muscles, and this is good review in the leg. And this is good review because you're going to have to learn these muscles soon in lab. So the muscle groups that we're going to talk about are on the posterior side of the thigh and the anterior front of the thigh. On the posterior side, the bicep femoris is one of the predominant, it's this muscle right here, is the predominant muscle, the prime mover that bends the knee. And so I have this arrow drawn here. The quadriceps femoris does the opposite action. It extends the knee. So if you want to bend the knee, you would have to excite the biceps femoris, I should maybe draw an E, and you would have to inhibit the quadriceps, because otherwise the two muscles would be fighting against one another. The other thing, though, is if you excite the quadriceps, that helps you plant your leg firmly on the ground. So we're going to look at this ipsilateral withdrawal reflex and then the contralateral side. So we have a poor guy here who stepped on a piece of broken glass on the beach. I'm not feeling terribly sorry for him because he's at a beach, but nonetheless, he's bleeding. The sensory information goes into the right side of the spinal cord. The action will be just like before, and that is we will get, on the right side, a withdrawal reflex. The biceps is going to contract, and the quadriceps should relax or at least be inhibited so that it's not contracting. What would happen if the exact same thing happened on the left side? Wouldn't be good, you'd fall over. So now let's look at what happens on the contralateral side. On the contralateral side, instead of flexing the knee, we are going to extend the knee. Probably the hip too, but we're not going to get that complicated. So notice the purple neurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord. These interneurons are what make this complex reflex possible, because they have such a network that they can control different motor neurons in different ways as a result of the same stimulus. So because of the pathway of these interneurons, motor neuron on the opposite side will be obviously excited and one will be inhibited, but it will be the opposite too. So, for example, on this left side, in response to pain, here comes the pain on the right side, the information travels over to the left side. Well, we don't want a withdrawal reflex over here because we're getting one on the right side. So the biceps needs to relax so that the quadriceps can contract. It has to contract. And it helps keep everything stable. And you're not bending your knee, because that's what the biceps femoris would do. So the summary of the crossed extensor withdrawal reflex is you have stimulation on the right side, and you get withdrawal from the right leg, but the left leg extends versus flexing. It stiffens. And so the two muscle groups involved will act differently because the motor neurons going to each of those muscle groups receive either excitatory or inhibitory signals, depending on which side you're on. So that's the last of the spinal cord lectures. The only other nervous system lecture we have is autonomic, and I'm going to work on that tonight so that I can give it to you on Monday. or just post it. Thank you.